Alright, off underway here in the second semifinal between DanV and SV. If you have noticed, the winner of this tournament will be a person with a V at the end of their names. Now, if that isn't life-changing, then I don't know what is. But yeah, here we go. World number 10 on the left versus the world number 9. Two-time UK champion versus the reigning UK champion. Both Masters winners. And SV going for some... Oh, that's a pretty terrible S piece to get there. Would have probably been fine with any other piece. Oh, must have been a misstep there with the L piece. And SV not really in danger of topping out, but could be using up a lot of his time here with burning this down. It's gonna give Dan the opportunity to immediately establish a lead. Having said that, though, SV slamming down the dirty Tetris. And he's gonna... No. No, he's still gonna go for another one. There you go. There's the long bar for the Tetris. 144, 780 for both players. Oh, Dan seems to have not been able to get an S piece over. Shouldn't be too much of an issue. It gets the next J piece over, so now just has to deal with the consequences being one hole. And just gonna decide to immediately burn it down, not gonna go for any row 2 shenanigans. So yeah, right now only one line really separating the two players. A single burn. So 266 here for Dan, 247 for SV. Yeah, right now, about a 1 Tetris lead here for Dan. Only thing separating the two players. Oh, Dan's board does need an L piece, preferably sooner rather than later. Solves it pretty decently, only ends up with one hole, while keeping his well open. 361 here for Dan, 364 for SV. So basically the same score, but SV with a slightly cleaner board. As Dan is building on top of this hole. Next lumbar to the right is going to be a triple, but now is set up for a row 2 Tetris. But that bit of burning is going to allow SV to now take a 15,000 point lead. So still not much separating the two players, really. 419 for Dan, 433 for SV. And Dan just gonna take the triple there with that lumbar, playing it safe. Meanwhile, SV with a very clean board, currently at 501. Dan at 471. So approaching the transition here. SV with a 50,000 point lead. Dan with a Lombard dependency. Gonna just take the Tetris there with small mess on his board, but shouldn't be anything too dangerous for Dan. Gets the bar over. So currently Dan on 19 at 579. SV at 618. So Dan now resorting to build on row 2, but now looks like he's going to take the opportunities to just burn this down. Take the compromise. And just as I say that, he's going to start setting up now for a center well, trying to go for a perfect well transfer. Didn't want to put the bar there because he wanted to skim to go for the perfect well transfer, which eventually does work out. 674 for Dan, but this has allowed SV to take now a 100,000 point lead on level 22. 784 SV, 674 for Dan. SV wasn't able to get the last Lombard over, but a couple of burns. Now should be able to get the next one over. There you go. Tetris there for SV goes up to 817. Dan at 763. So 827 here for Dan. 879 for SV. SV is half a level behind as well in lines. So just under 100,000 point lead here. Yes, this tournament is held in the wonderful city of Yelena. Ooh, 2 difficult Z pieces there for SV. Shouldn't be too much drama. Trying to burn this down. Would have loved the 3 wide. Now needs a T piece. Ooh, Dan now actually in some danger. 932 for Dan. 956 for SV. And Dan running into issues here. Right now, Dan just scrambling to try and take this board down so he can give himself a decent platform to try and get a good post 29 going. Takes a single right there into 29 at 957, but this board is really up high, and Dan's going to top out at 958 and SV. A67 is already good. SV willingly builds Lombard dependency and is going to fill it in. Side here for SV could really use an abundance of S pieces. Decides to solve it in an alternate way. 54,000 for SV, 69,000 for Dan. SV setting up a delayed Vits. And unfortunately gets away with it. Tetris there for Dan goes up to 93,000. SV with the Tetris goes up to 79,000. Well, excuse me, as a man of integrity and morality, how can I be happy when a delayed vids goes unpunished? So 186 here for Dan, 151 for SV. Dan, about a 2 Tetris advantage here. Still very early days here on 18. SV needing to do a bit of burning. It's going to allow Dan here to establish a decent lead as we're around about the halfway point of level 18. 326 here for Dan, goes up to 349. SV now Tetris ready at 251, waiting for the bar. So, one Tetris shy of a 100,000 point lead here for Dan. Right now both players clean. Both Tetrising. Wonderful. So yeah, at the moment, Dan maintaining this 100,000 point lead. SV not really able to make much of a dent into this lead. All he can do is try and keep up, as Dan has been staying efficient, not really giving SV too many opportunities to catch up. This is actually a very good 18 game here for Dan. For competitive Tetris, at least. 557 here for Dan. SV at 485. Here for Dan as he's waiting for a T or a Z. Eventually gets the T. 627 here for Dan. 511 for SV. And there's the transition for Dan at 675. Very strong transition score here for Dan. SV meanwhile going to transition at 581. Definitely not a weak transition score, but still finding himself 100,000 points behind at the level change. Waiting for this. Yeah, that's what it's called. What do you think? 710 here for Dan, sorry. SV at 634. SV staying very efficient, but unfortunately not able to make a single dent into this 100,000 point lead, as Dan just keeps Tetrising even into level 21 here. What looking at a very strong pace here for Dan. 814 on level 21. Make that 842 into level 22. 719 here for SV. Another Tetris for Dan. Dan, having dropped game 1 with a bit of a suffer game, definitely making a statement here in game number 2 with very strong pace. Still the 100,000 point lead. Says something about how well SV has been playing, that he's been Tetrising all this time. And Dan as well. And the leads just stayed the exact same. Dan with the Tetris. Looking for a 24 max. I don't know if that's still on the table. Probably not. But still a very early max out here for Dan. At least assuming he gets the next line. There you go. 1 million points here for Dan after 194 lines. SV though with the Tetris goes up to 960. So actually SV being able to make a dent into this lead. The one little slip up that Dan had, and SV straight on it. Now within striking distance of Dan. A41 here for Dan, 992 for SV. SV with Tetris goes up to the A24. Dan up to A74. Dan's board looking a little problematic. Oh, misdrop there of the TP. Should still have enough time to manage this. There you go. There you go. Tuck of the T. And Dan's board is clean once again. But SV has actually taken the lead here. Currently at B35. Dan at B21. Both players with the same amount of Tetrises available. So currently B91 here for Dan. One more Tetris available. B79 for SV. One more Tetris available. But Dan gonna burn into the transition at B95. Set up for the Tetris on 29. SV also into 29 at C22. Ooh, SV not able to get the 4-tap over to the right side. Now doing some cleanup. C35 here for SV. C12 for Dan. Dan set up for the Tetris, gets the Tetris. C58 here for Dan. Now Dan trying to go on a roll. Set up for the next Tetris. Ooh, doesn't get the taps over, and SV is going to take the game. What, Timmy, who did you think it was? Someone came in today and was like, oh, is this Burb Wizard? So I don't know, I guess I sound different. Okay, so Dan, starting off with a bit of burning. Could go for a 3 white to set up a perfect wall transfer, and it's going to do exactly that. 33,000 here for Dan, 47,000 for SV. Ooh. SV now set up for a dirty Atom Well. It's going to get the touch, goes up to 75,000. And is, of course, going to go for another dirty Atom Well. Now, SV set up for a dirty right well. Because that is what he does. And there's Tetris for SV, although unfortunately had to sacrifice his board health for that Tetris. So now, he's going to be forced to burn. Although Dan as well, may be forced to burn, but able to reopen the well and gets the Tetris. 134 Dan, 133 for SV. So it's looking, yeah, seems like a very strange seed considering the amount of supernatural activities here. Usually I don't see this from these players, but there you go. SV with the Tetris goes up to 192. Dan with the Tetris goes up to 228. SV now set up for a perfect well transfer. Tetris doesn't get the bar though, and now needs to uncover the right side before he can fill up that hole. So 250 here for SV, 308 for Dan. Oh, SV misdrop there of the Z piece, just didn't rotate it in time. And now, still survivable, but gonna have to be careful. And it's at the very least gonna cost them even more burning. Why is SV playing like... Have you ever met SV? This is what he does. And SV is doing good to try and set up these perfect well transfer setups, but they're just not gonna work if he's not getting the bar in time. There you go. Now it just needs to take a single. Good adjustment there. So after dubious 18 play, it's going to be 452 here for Dan, 336 for SV. So Dan looking good here with this lead, as he's going to need to reel off 3 games in a row if he wants to make the finals here in Vienna. And there you go, transition there for SV at 406,000 points. SV, very respectful player, giving nice honor to all the DAS players out there by getting a 400k transition. Dan, meanwhile, on 19 as well at 595. SV at 464. So yeah, Dan was able to have a lead for basically all of last game. But then, even as his 29 was looking good, just had some inexplicable long bars to the right that didn't go over, which allowed SV to take the 2-0 advantage, but Dan here looking to do better here with this lead that he has in this game. Tetris here for Dan goes up to 680, SV at 600,000. SV is also 1 level ahead, so potentially an even bigger lead than last game here for Dan. So 765 here for Dan, 789 for SV. Oh, Dan there with some inexplicable misdrops, but doing well to just turn this down. Has some leeway. So SV yet to catch up to Dan's score despite being a little bit ahead in lines, and Dan gonna use that buffer to just safely burn it down. Now wants a J piece though. Let's solve it with a tuck of the long bar instead. L piece here for Dan. Needs a J. So 846 here for Dan. 798 for SV. So SV already on level 28, currently at 900,000. Dan slightly ahead, but is 2 levels behind. So Dan with quite a lead here in terms of runway towards 29. SV here, gonna transition to level 29 at 973. Set up for the Tetris, gets the Tetris onto 29. Currently at A11. Tetris there for Dan. Has 2 more Tetris available before level 19. Great adjustment there for Dan. Gonna sacrifice one of the Tetris there for a safety double. And Tetris here for Dan into level 29 at A91. SV meanwhile on level 30 at A58. Dan at 1.1. Oh, misdrops here for Dan. Dan trying to burn this down, but now needs something over to the left side. Needs to fix this left side ASAP, and SV has already taken the lead. So Dan needs to get out of this. Dan needs to get out of this. Gets the J piece over somehow, but still needs cooperation from the pieces. It's not going to happen. Dan tops out at B17 and SV in a sweep. Is going to move on to the finals.